"You did it on purpose," I said, indignantly seizing him by the arm. "By God, I had no idea," he cowered, immediately starting to lie and pretend to be miserable. "The verses were just brought, and I thought, as a merry joke, you never thought any such thing. Can you possibly find that giftless trash a merry joke?" "Yes, sir, I do." "You're simply lying, and it wasn't just brought to you. You wrote it yourself, together with Lebyadkin, maybe yesterday, to cause a scandal. The last line is certainly yours, and the part about the beetle as well. Why did he come out in a tailcoat? It means you were preparing to have him read. If he hadn't gotten drunk?" Liputin looked at me coldly and caustically. "What business is it of yours?" he asked suddenly, with a strange calm. "What? You're wearing one of these bows, too. Where's Peter Stepanovich?" "I don't know, somewhere around. Why?" "Because I see through it now. This is simply a conspiracy against Yulia Mikhailovna, to disgrace the day." Liputin again looked askance at me. "And what is that to you?" he grinned, shrugged, and walked off. I felt as if stricken. All my suspicions were justified, and I had still hoped I was mistaken. What was I to do? I thought of discussing it with Stepan Trofimovich, but he was standing in front of the mirror, trying on various smiles and constantly consulting a piece of paper on which he had made some notes. He was to go on right after Karmazinov and was no longer in any condition to talk with me. Should I run to Yulia Mikhailovna? But it was too soon for her. She needed a much harsher lesson to cure her of the conviction of her surroundedness and the general fanatical devotion. She would not believe me and would regard me as a dreamer. And how could she be of help? I thought, really, what business is it of mine? I'll take the bow off and go home. Once it starts. I actually said, once it starts. I remember that. But I had to go and listen to Karmazinov. Taking a last look around backstage, I noticed that there were quite a few outsiders and even women darting about, coming and going. This backstage was quite a narrow space, totally screened off from the public by a curtain, and connected through a corridor and back with other rooms. Here our readers waited their turns, but I was particularly struck at that moment by the lecturer who was to follow Stepan Trofimovich. He, too, was some sort of professor, even now I do not know exactly what he was, who had voluntarily retired from some institution after some student incident and had turned up in our town for one reason or another just a few days earlier. He, too, had been recommended to Yulia Mikhailovna, and she had received him with reverence. I know now that he had visited her only on one evening prior to the reading, had spent the whole evening in silence, had smiled ambiguously at the jokes and tone of the company that surrounded Yulia Mikhailovna, and had made an unpleasant impression on everyone by his air, arrogant and at the same time touchy to the point of timorousness. It was Yulia Mikhailovna herself who had recruited him to read. Now he was pacing from corner to corner and, like Stepan Trofimovich, was whispering to himself as well, but looking at the ground, not in the mirror. He did not try on any smiles, though he smiled frequently and carnivorously. Clearly it was not possible to talk with him either. He was short, looked about 40, was bald front and back, had a grayish little beard, and dressed decently. But most interesting was that at each turn he raised his right fist high, shook it in the air above his head, and suddenly brought it down as if crushing some adversary to dust. He repeated this trick every moment. It gave me an eerie feeling. I ran quickly to listen to Karmazinov. Again, something ominous seemed to hover over the audience. Let me be quite clear on this point. I venerate genius. What I cannot understand is why so many of our geniuses behave like little boys toward the end of their glorious careers. Couldn't he see that even if his name was Karmazinov, and even if he swaggered onto the platform like 5 court chamberlains rolled into one, he still couldn't hold such an audience for a full hour by reading that one piece of his? In general, I've observed that even a super genius cannot impose upon the public's attention for more than 20 minutes at a light literary reading without risking unpleasant consequences. True, the great man's appearance on the stage was greeted with considerable respect. The most severe old gentlemen displayed some curiosity and approval, and their ladies even a certain enthusiasm. The clapping, however, was brief and somewhat discordant. But at least there was no demonstration from the back room until Mr. Karmazinov actually began to speak, and even then it was nothing particularly hostile, just a simple misunderstanding. As I have mentioned before, Karmazinov's voice was rather shrill, even slightly feminine, and on top of all that, the great poet spoke with a genuine aristocratic lisp. So, as soon as he had said a few words, someone began to titter, probably some inexperienced fool given to giggling, who had never come across anyone of such distinction before. But there was no heckling. Indeed, they shushed the fool, and he fell silent, completely crushed. But then, lisping and modulating his voice, Mr. Karmazinov declared that at first he, quote, wouldn't hear of reading, end of quote, hear. Why did he have to announce that? That, quote, there are certain lines that come from so deep in a singing heart that they cannot be altered, they cannot be uttered aloud, and such sacred things really ought not to be offered to the public, end of quote. Why was he offering them then? But, quote, they pleaded with me so insistently that I decided to offer them, end of quote. And since he was laying down his pen once and for all and had sworn never to write again, well, he had consented to write this very last piece. And since he had also sworn never to read anything again in public, well, he had consented to read this piece publicly, and so on in that vein. Even that wouldn't have mattered too much because everyone knows what an author's introduction is like, although, considering our public's lack of education and the irritability of the back rows, it could have had an unfavorable effect. Wouldn't he have done better to read us one of the short, very short stories, such as he used to write, somewhat overpolished and affected, but still quite witty? It would have served the day. But that was not his idea at all. Instead, he delivered a long, moralizing oration, and what wasn't there in it? I am sure that even a Petersburg audience would have been reduced to a state of stupor, to say nothing of ours. Just imagine 10,000 words of the most affected and vacuous chatter, and this gentleman reading it condescendingly with a sort of long-suffering expression that was rather insulting to his audience. As to his subject, but who on earth could tell what he was talking about? As to his subject, but who on earth could tell what he was talking about? It was some sort of an account of some sort of impressions and reminiscences. But what actually had impressed him and what he was reminiscing about remained unclear. And knit though we might our provincial brows during the first half of his reading, we still couldn't make heads or tails of it. So during the second half, we relaxed and just listened out of politeness. To be sure, there was a lot about love, the love of a man of genius for some lady or other, but I must say, if anything, it sounded rather embarrassing. The short, rotund figure of the great writer made the story of his first kiss a bit unconvincing, I felt, and what made it positively irritating was that his kisses were quite unlike those exchanged by the rest of humankind. When the kissing took place, there were always gorse bushes growing nearby or some other outlandish plant that one would need a botanical atlas to identify. And the sky always had a peculiar violet highlight that no mortal had ever noticed before. That is, everyone had seen it, but no one had ever noticed it until he, Karmazinov, saw it and described it to us, bunch of fools that we were, as if it were the most ordinary thing. The tree under which this fascinating couple elected to sit was unfailingly of some orangey color, and they sat under it somewhere in Germany. Suddenly they have a vision of Pompeii or Cassius on the eve of battle, and a chill of rapture runs down their backs. Some water fairy then squeaks in the bushes, and among the reeds Gluck strikes up his violin. The name of the piece he is playing is mentioned in full, on Toots' letters, but no one has ever heard of it, and you'd have to go and look it up in a musical dictionary. In the meantime, mist begins billowing, and it billows and finally looks more like a million pillows than mist. Suddenly all that vanishes, and we are shown the great man of genius crossing a thawing Volga on a warm winter's day. The crossing covers 2.5 pages, but he nevertheless manages to fall through a hole in the ice. And does the genius drown? Oh no, he hasn't the slightest intention of drowning. He has simply brought it in to tell you that when he was about to go under and was swallowing the cold water, he suddenly caught sight of a tiny, pea-sized ice floe, pure and transparent, quote, like a frozen tear, end of quote. And in that ice flow he saw the reflection of all Germany, or to be more accurate, of the German sky, and its iridescent glitter reminded him of the tear that, quote, "Don't you remember, rolled down your cheek when we sat under a turquoise tree and when you cried out in rapture, 'There is no crime.' To which through my tears I answered, 'Yes, but then there are no saints either.' Whereupon we burst into sobs and parted forever," end of quote. She goes off to the seashore somewhere and he to some sort of caves. He goes down and down and down for 3 years. This happens in Moscow under the Sukharev Tower. Then, suddenly, in a cavern in the bowels of the earth, he finds a sanctuary lamp, and in front of that lamp a praying hermit. The man of genius presses his face to the bars of a little window and suddenly hears a sigh. Now you may think it is the hermit sighing, but why should he bother with the hermit? This sigh reminds him of her first sigh 37 years ago when, quote, "Do you remember? We sat under an agate tree in Germany and you said to me, 'Why, love? Look, the ruddle is blooming all around us and I love you, but when the ruddle ceases to bloom, my love will be over,'" end of quote. At this point, the mist started billowing again. Hoffmann came on the scene. A mermaid whistled something by Chopin, and suddenly the laurel-crowned head of Ancus Marcius appeared out of the mist above the roofs of Rome. A shudder of exaltation seized them, and they parted forever, and so on. I haven't told it properly and cannot report it with great accuracy, but this was the gist of his chatter. And here I must also decry the unfortunate propensity some great intellects have for witticisms. Great European philosophers, famous scholars, inventors, martyrs, toilers, all of them are like mere flunkies in the pantry of the great Russian man of genius. He is the master. They report to him hat in hand when he summons them, and stand awaiting his orders. True, he scoffs scornfully at Russia too, and is anxious to demonstrate her bankruptcy to the great European intellects. But when it comes to himself, oh no. He puts himself incomparably above the greatest European intelligences who, to him, are nothing but raw material for his witty observations. For that, he takes hold of someone else's idea, splices its antithesis onto it, and he has a witty paradox ready at his disposal. There is crime, there is no crime. There is no truth, there are no saints. Atheism, Darwinism, the bells of Moscow. Alas, although he no longer believes in Moscow's church bells, he needs Roman laurels. But no, laurels won't do anymore either. So he has a standard fit of Byronian torment, twists his face into Haynes' grin, picks something out of Lermontov's pecorin, and his engine is on its way, huffing, puffing, and whistling. But after all, he seems to hint, please praise me, I get a terrific kick out of it. Why, I'm just pretending to be putting down my pen. Just wait and see. I'll bore you 300 times more and you'll get tired of reading me yet. Of course, the end was none too good, but the bad thing was that everything started with it. Long since there had begun the shuffling, nose-blowing, coughing, and all else that occurs at a literary reading when the writer, whoever he may be, keeps the public longer than 20 minutes. But the writer of genius did not notice any of it. He went on lisping and mumbling, totally oblivious of the public, so that everyone began to be perplexed. Then suddenly in the back rows a lonely but loud voice was heard. Lord, what rubbish! This popped out inadvertently, and I am sure without any demonstrativeness. The man simply got tired, but Mr. Karmazinov paused, looked mockingly at the public, and suddenly lisped with the bearing of an offended court chamberlain. It seems, ladies and gentlemen, that you are rather bored with me. And here's where he was at fault. And having spoken first, for in thus provoking a response he gave all sorts of scum an opportunity to speak as well, and even legitimately, as it were, while if he had refrained, they would have blown their noses a little longer, and it would all have gone over somehow. Perhaps he expected applause in response to his question, but there was no applause. On the contrary, everyone became as if frightened, shrank down, and kept still. You never saw any Ancus Marcius. That's all just style, came one irritated, even as if pained voice. Precisely, another voice picked up at once. There are no ghosts nowadays, only natural science. Look it up in natural sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, such objections were the last thing I expected. Karmazinov was terribly surprised. The great genius had grown totally unaccustomed to his fatherland in Karlsruhe. In our age, it's shameful to read that the world stands on 3 fishes. A young girl suddenly rattled out. You couldn't have gone down to some hermit in a cave, Karmazinov. Who even talks about hermits nowadays? What surprises me most, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's all so serious. However, you are perfectly right. No one respects real truth more than I do. Though he was smiling ironically, all the same he was greatly struck. His face simply said, I'm not the way you think. I'm for you. Only praise me more. As much as possible. I like it terribly. Ladies and gentlemen, he cried at last, now completely wounded. I see that my poor little poem got to the wrong place. And I think I myself got to the wrong place. Aimed at a crow and got a cow, some fool, undoubtedly drunk, shouted at the top of his lungs. And of course, he ought to have been ignored. True, there was irreverent laughter. A cow, you say? Karmazinov picked up at once. His voice was becoming more and more shrill. Concerning crows and cows, ladies and gentlemen, I shall allow myself to refrain. I have too much respect, even for any sort of public, to allow myself comparisons. However innocent, but I thought, anyhow, dear sir, you'd better not be so, someone shouted from the back rows. But I supposed that, as I was putting down my pen and saying farewell to the reader, I would be heard. No, we want to listen, we do, several voices emboldened at last came from the front row. Read, several rapturous ladies' voices picked up, and at last some applause broke through. Though scant and thin, it's true, Karmazinov smiled wryly and rose from his place. Believe me, Karmazinov, everyone even regards it as an honor. Even the marshal's wife could not restrain herself. Mr. Karmazinov, a fresh, youthful voice suddenly came from the depths of the hall. It was the voice of a very young teacher from the district high school, an excellent young man, quiet and noble, still a recent arrival in our town. He even rose slightly from his place. Mr. Karmazinov, if I had the good fortune to love as you have described to us, I really wouldn't put anything about my love into an article intended for public reading. He even blushed all over. Ladies and gentlemen, Karmazinov cried, I have ended. I omit the ending and I withdraw. But permit me to read just the 6 concluding lines. Yes, friend and reader, farewell, he began at once from the manuscript and now without sitting down in his chair. Farewell, reader, I do not even much insist that we should part friends. Why indeed trouble you? Abuse me even. Oh, abuse me as much as you like, if it gives you any pleasure. But it will be best of all if we forget each other forever, and if all of you readers should suddenly be so good as to fall on your knees and entreat me with tears, write for us, Karmazinov, for the fatherland, for posterity, for the wreaths of laurel. Even then I would answer you, having thanked you, of course, with all courtesy. Ah, no. We have had enough of bothering each other, my dear compatriots. Merci. It is time we parted ways. Merci, merci, merci. Karmazinov bowed ceremoniously and all red as though he had been boiled, made for backstage. Nobody's going down on his knees. A wild fancy. What conceit. It's just humor, someone a bit more sensible corrected. No, spare us your humor. This is impudence anyhow, gentlemen. He's finished now at least. What a heap of boredom. But all these ignorant exclamations from the back rows, though not only from the back rows, were drowned by the applause of the other part of the public. Karmazinov was called back. Several ladies, Yulia Mikhailovna and the marshal's wife at their head, crowded up to the platform. In Yulia Mikhailovna's hands there appeared a magnificent wreath of laurel on a white velvet cushion, inside another wreath of live roses. Laurels, Karmazinov said with a subtle and somewhat caustic grin. I am moved, of course, and accept this wreath, prepared beforehand, but as yet unwithered, with lively emotion. But I assure you, mesdames, I have suddenly become so much of a realist that I consider laurels in our age rather more fitting in the hands of a skillful cook than in mine. Except that cooks are more useful, cried that same seminarian who had attended the meeting at Virginsky's. The order was somewhat disrupted. People from many rows jumped up to see the ceremony with the laurel wreath. I'd add 3 more rubles for a cook, another voice picked up loudly, even too loudly, insistently loudly. So would I. But do they really have no buffet here? Gentlemen, it's sheer deception. However, it must be admitted that all these unbridled gentlemen were still very afraid of our dignitaries and also of the police officer who was there in the hall. After about 10 minutes, everyone settled down again anyhow. But the former order was not restored, and it was into this burgeoning chaos that poor Stepan Trofimovitch stepped.